In the summer heat of 1974, the Smurl family packed their belongings and moved into what they believed would be the perfect home in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. The two-story duplex stood quietly on a peaceful suburban street, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and families who waved as they passed by. For Jack and Janet Smurl, it was a new beginning after years of hard work and saving. They shared the home with Jack's elderly parents, hoping to build a life filled with love, laughter, and stability. The day they moved in, sunlight poured through the windows and the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and new opportunities. It was supposed to be a place where their children could grow without worry, a place they could finally call their own. At first, life in the house seemed normal. The days passed in a comfortable rhythm of unpacking boxes, fixing up rooms, and planning family dinners. But within weeks, tiny cracks began to show, subtle things that were easy to ignore at first. The kitchen lights flickered even though the wiring was new. Strange, damp stains began to appear on freshly painted walls, only to vanish hours later. Janet would catch whiffs of something rotten, like decaying meat, drifting through the halls even when the kitchen was spotless. She blamed the old pipes or the summer humidity, brushing it off as something that could easily be fixed. But the noises were harder to explain. At night, when the family settled down, soft footsteps echoed from the attic even though no one ever went up there. Sometimes there were faint knocks behind the walls, as if someone were trapped inside trying to get out. Jack's mother mentioned hearing whispers late at night, faint and distant, as though the house itself was murmuring secrets. Janet tried to comfort her, saying it was probably the wind, but she too had begun to feel uneasy in the stillness of the night. The strange occurrences continued to grow. The family dog, usually calm and affectionate, began acting skittish. It would bark at corners of the room, hair raised, teeth bared, but there was never anything there. On more than one occasion, the dog refused to enter certain rooms, whining until someone carried it out. The air in those rooms often felt colder than the rest of the house, heavy and damp, as if something unseen was watching. Even the children noticed that something was wrong. They complained of nightmares and said they heard someone calling their names from the hallway. Janet tried to assure them that it was just their imagination, but deep down, she felt the same strange presence. The once cheerful sound of laughter in the home was replaced by quiet tension. Jack, ever practical, tried to find logical explanations for everything: the wiring, the plumbing, the old wood settling. But every explanation failed to bring peace. The disturbances weren't stopping. They were growing bolder. As the weeks turned into months, the Smurls began to realize that what they had brought their family into wasn't just an old house. It was something darker, something that had been waiting for them long before they arrived. By 1976, the disturbances in the Smurl home had grown far beyond anything that could be brushed aside as coincidence. What began as faint whispers and flickering lights had turned into something violent, unpredictable, and terrifying. The once cozy duplex now felt heavy with dread, as though the air itself was thick with unseen energy. Every member of the family felt it. They couldn't see what haunted them, but they could feel its presence in every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, and every chill that swept through the house without reason. The first serious incident happened one night when Janet was folding laundry in the basement. The lights began to flicker, dimming slowly until the room went completely dark. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, followed by a sudden crash that made her drop the basket in fright. When she turned the lights back on, she found heavy pipes ripped from their fixtures and water pouring across the floor. Jack rushed down to help, but there was no explanation for how solid metal could twist apart on its own. The incident left them shaken, but it was only the beginning. Soon the house became a place of constant tension. Furniture moved across rooms when no one was watching. Dresser drawers slid open in the middle of the night and the smell of rotting meat returned, stronger and more unbearable than before. Sometimes Janet woke in the early hours to find her blankets pulled from the bed or her hair tangled around the bedpost, as if something had been hovering over her while she slept. The sounds of scratching inside the walls grew louder each night, followed by muffled voices that seemed to come from deep beneath the floors. Jack began to change too. Once calm and patient, he became irritable and quick to anger. He often complained about a crushing pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He would wake drenched in sweat, insisting that something had tried to pull him from the bed. During the day, he felt constantly drained, as if the house was slowly leaching his energy. Janet noticed dark circles forming under his eyes and a growing distance between them. The haunting wasn't just attacking the house, it was tearing at their minds. Even the children could no longer escape the fear. They spoke of a dark figure that stood silently at the end of their beds, its outline barely visible but its presence unmistakable. When they described it, each child's story matched perfectly. Tall, shadowed, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light around it. The family began sleeping together in one room, hoping that closeness would protect them. It didn't. Days turned into weeks of sleepless nights, strange noises, and objects flying without warning. The Smurls stopped inviting guests over, afraid of being labeled insane. The house, once filled with laughter, had turned into a place of despair. And though they didn't yet understand it, what they were facing wasn't just a haunting. It was something that fed on their fear, growing stronger every time they tried to ignore it. As the haunting deepened, desperation began to take hold of the Smurl family. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, and the feeling of being watched every hour of the day began to erode their sense of normalcy. Janet felt like she was living inside a nightmare that refused to end. No matter how hard she cleaned, prayed, or tried to ignore the strange happenings, the evil in the house only seemed to grow stronger. By 1978, the family had reached a breaking point. They could no longer deny that something unexplainable was tormenting them. The first time the church was involved, Janet had gone alone. She spoke quietly to a local priest, explaining the strange occurrences that plagued their home. The priest listened but appeared skeptical. He suggested that perhaps the family was under stress, that moving in with extended relatives could create tension, and that imagination could play cruel tricks on tired minds. Still, he agreed to visit the house. When he arrived, he walked from room to room, sprinkling holy water and saying blessings under his breath. The Smurls followed him in silence, hoping to feel relief. For a brief moment, the air seemed lighter, and Janet allowed herself to believe that maybe it was over. But that night, the house came alive in ways it never had before. Loud bangs erupted from inside the walls, shaking picture frames and rattling the furniture. Mirrors cracked as if struck by an invisible hand, and a foul odor filled the air so thickly it made everyone gag. Janet's mother-in-law collapsed from shock, and Jack had to drag her outside. It was as though the house was mocking the priest's efforts, feeding on their fear and defiance. From that night forward, the activity grew stronger and more aggressive. The family began to lose things. Objects they used daily, keys, jewelry, even family photos, would vanish, only to be found later in impossible places, like sealed boxes in the attic, or buried beneath piles of clothes they hadn't touched in weeks. Once Janet found every framed picture of the family ripped apart and scattered across the living room floor. The sight left her trembling. It felt deliberate, as if something inside the house wanted to erase their memories, their connection, their very identity. Jack's mental state worsened. He became withdrawn, often staring blankly at the walls as if listening to voices no one else could hear. He claimed to feel a presence pressing down on his chest at night, holding him still while whispers filled his ears. Sometimes he woke up with scratches on his skin, long and deep, though there was nothing in the room that could have caused them. Janet tried to comfort him, but fear was consuming her too. What frightened her most was how the evil seemed to adapt. It learned their weaknesses. When they tried to pray, the air grew colder and the lights flickered violently. When they ignored it, it lashed out, slamming doors and shaking the floors. The Smurls realized they were no longer living in a haunted house. They were trapped in a war they didn't understand, and the enemy was something they couldn't see, touch, or escape. When the Smurl family finally contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren in the mid-1980s, they had already spent nearly a decade living in fear. The Warrens were well-known investigators in the world of the paranormal, having studied hundreds of haunting cases. When they first stepped inside the Smurl home, they immediately sensed that something was wrong. The air felt thick and charged, heavy with a presence that was neither welcoming nor passive. Lorraine, who claimed to have clairvoyant sensitivity, described it as a dark cloud that had learned to think. The family clung to their hope that the Warrens could give them answers that the church, the police, and even science had failed to provide. The Warrens began their investigation quietly, setting up audio recorders and monitoring equipment in the house. They asked the family to keep a journal of every strange event, no matter how small. Within days, the activity intensified. Loud knocks echoed through the walls, and objects moved in front of the investigators. Lorraine said she felt multiple entities in the house, some lost and confused, others hateful and dangerous. She believed one was demonic, manipulating the weaker spirits to torment the family. Ed captured strange growling noises on tape, followed by a low guttural voice that seemed to call out Jack's name. Neighbors began to notice strange occurrences as well. Lights in the Smurl home flickered at odd hours, and unearthly sounds carried through the still night air. Some neighbors reported seeing shadowy figures passing by the windows even when the entire family was outside. The haunting had spread beyond the walls. It was now affecting everyone who came near the house. Despite this, the Warrens urged the Smurls to stay strong, to resist the fear that seemed to fuel the entity's power, but the evil presence refused to relent. Janet felt unseen hands shove her, leaving bruises that couldn't be explained. Doors slammed shut with such force that the frames cracked. Religious symbols placed around the house were found broken or upside down. One night, the family was awakened by the sound of violent banging on the walls, followed by a deep voice shouting words they couldn't understand. The entire house shook as though an earthquake had struck. When it stopped, silence hung in the air so thick it was almost painful. The Warrens called for several priests to assist in a formal exorcism. The rituals were long and exhausting, but even after multiple attempts, nothing seemed to change. The house continued to breathe, groan, and react to every effort made against it. Lorraine warned that what they were facing might not be confined to the property. It was attached to the family itself, feeding off their fear, anger, and despair. Despite their growing hopelessness, the Smurls refused to give up. They prayed daily, kept the lights on through the night, and clung to one another for strength. But deep down, they knew the truth that terrified them most. Whatever had invaded their lives was far stronger than anything they could understand, and no amount of faith or science seemed capable of driving it away. In 1987, after 13 years of relentless fear, the Smurl family made the decision they had been dreading for years. They packed up what little peace they had left and left the house that had once been their dream home. The walls that had echoed with laughter when they first arrived now stood as silent witnesses to years of torment. The family didn't make an announcement, didn't tell the neighbors, and didn't look back as they drove away. They simply wanted to leave behind the nightmare that had consumed their lives. For a while, it seemed to work. Their new home was smaller, quieter, and felt safe. For the first few weeks, there were no sounds, no strange smells, and no cold chills that swept through the rooms. Janet started sleeping again, and the children began smiling like they used to. Jack found himself feeling lighter, free from the unseen pressure that had haunted him for years. It was as if the darkness had finally been left behind, but the peace did not last. One night, as Janet lay half asleep, she heard a soft whisper close to her ear. It said her name slowly, in a voice she recognized instantly. Her body froze. She opened her eyes and stared into the dark room, but nothing was there. Still, the air around her had changed. It was colder, heavier, and carried that same faint smell of decay she thought she'd escaped. She didn't wake Jack. She simply lay still, trying to convince herself it was a dream. But deep down, she knew the truth. The thing that had tormented them hadn't stayed behind. It had followed them. Over the next few weeks, the old signs began to reappear. A television turned on by itself in the middle of the night. Doors that were locked were found open in the morning. Footsteps moved through empty rooms. Janet felt her strength fading again, that same familiar exhaustion creeping back into her bones. Jack tried to hide his worry, pretending not to notice the cold spots that returned or the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. But one night, when he felt something tug sharply at his blanket, he sat upright in bed, terrified. He didn't have to say anything. Janet was already awake, staring at the same corner of the room. The Smurls sought help again, but this time no one could do much. The church performed more blessings, but the activity seemed to fade and return in unpredictable waves. Some nights were calm, others unbearable. Eventually, the family stopped talking about it altogether. They lived quietly, never staying in one place too long, never trusting the silence for too long either. Their story became one of the most famous paranormal cases in American history, sparking debates and documentaries. Some called them victims, Others called them liars. But to the Smurls, the truth was something they had lived with and could never escape. Whether it was evil from another world or darkness born from their own suffering, it had marked them forever. Even years later, when their story faded from headlines, the memory of that whisper, the one that followed them wherever they went, remained a haunting reminder that some evils do not die. They wait, they follow, and they never truly leave.